All right. Well, welcome everyone. If you're watching in the future, happy Thanksgiving. But I would like to begin our chat with Judith Mackrell by telling you a bit about the Country Bookshop in downtown Southern Pines, North Carolina. We are unique in that we are a bookstore that is part of a small community, twice weekly award-winning newspaper called The Pilot. We're a general bookstore for kids and adults, and we love this time of year helping everyone find just the right gift or thing for you to read. And so I thank you for tuning in today with our chat with Judith Mackrell. Let me introduce Judith to y'all. Judith is a celebrated dance critic, writing first for The Independent and now for The Guardian. She has appeared on television and radio and lives in London with her family. She has written 6 books: The Unfinished Palazzo, the story of 3 women who seduced and beguiled Venice: Louisa Casti, Doris Castle-Rose, and Peggy Guggenheim; The Bloomsbury Ballerina, Lydia Lepokova, Imperial Dancer, and Mrs. John Maynard Keynes, which was shortlisted for the Costa Biography Award. She's written Out of Line, the story of British New Dance, was the co-author of the Oxford Dictionary of Dance, and wrote Flappers, 6 Women of a Dangerous Generation, which featured the lives of 6 figures like Lady Diana Cooper, Nancy Kennard, Tallulah Bankhead, Zella Fitzgerald, Josephine Baker, and Tamara de Lempicka. Today, we are here to talk about the women doing war reporting during World War II, including Martha Gellhorn, Lee Miller, Sigrid Schultz, Virginia Cowles, Clare Hollingworth, and Helen Kirkpatrick, that you have so brilliantly captured in your book, The Correspondents, 6 Women Writers on the Front Lines of World War II. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful to talk to you.
Well, I want to begin with a quote that I'm going to read to you. Certainly, their motivations for going to war were a little different from those of their male peers. When Sigrid Schultz faced off the Gestapo in Berlin, when Lee Miller brazened out her private war in St. Malo, when Clare Hollingworth reported on the invasion of Poland, or Virginia Cowles raised prison in Spain, they were all driven by a basic hunger for action, a desire to be living their lives on a razor edge, or as Martha Gellhorn put it, to be getting something out of history that is more than anyone has a decent right to hope for. Like the best of their colleagues, they also went to war with a sense of vocation, with a commitment to the truth and a pledge to speak out of the silent millions. High on thrills and adrenaline, yet dedicated to making themselves in the eye, ears, and hearts of their readers, these women didn't strive to be the best female journalists, but simply to be among the best in their profession. And I'm wondering if you could speak to this quote a little bit. Did you know this all going in, or is this dedication something you discovered kind of only through your research?
Yeah, I mean, in the years before I started this book, I actually knew almost nothing about these women journalists who reported so bravely and so tenaciously from the front lines of World War II. I'd heard of Martha Gellhorn and Lee Miller, and I knew that they had made their way to the war. But I kind of thought that they were just unusual. They were the exceptions, and that them getting there was just part of the extraordinary life stories of 2 extraordinary women. And it was only when the idea came to me for writing this book and just researching around it that I realized that, yeah, there was a small number, certainly, of these women, but a really significant number, and that between them, they had written about the Second World War with a very distinctively female voice, and that they did rank up there with their male colleagues.
It's interesting. You talk about the female voice, and your rave New York Times book review was written by Christina Lamb, who is the chief foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times of London. And she also wrote Our Bodies, Their Battlefields, War Through the Lives of Women. And she highlighted what you document so brilliantly in the book, that time and time again, these 6 women were able to, as she says, scoop the world Why?
Well, in a way, I need to go a little bit back and explain that the conditions for them scooping the world were actually incredibly difficult. Because when war broke out in 1939, the British War Office and then subsequently the American War Office, when America joined the war, had every intention of keeping women reporters from the front lines. They still, the military bureaucracy still harbored very old-fashioned notions of women being the weaker sex. And so they felt that they simply had no place in the sort of blood and danger and noise of battle. They were afraid that also that the women would be a distraction somehow, either that male soldiers, out of some sort of misplaced chivalry, would be too worried about looking after a lone female journalist near the front line than he would be about fighting the enemy, or even worse, that these soldiers who'd been separated from their wives and girlfriends for so long would be somehow stimulated to scenes of sexual rioting when faced with a beautiful female journalist in uniform. But their main concern, was this utter obsession with conveniences, with toilets. They could not conceive of how they could arrange for men and women to somehow be relieving themselves in the same, in proximity to each other. And it seemed very bizarre that these women who were prepared to brave bullets and bombs and shells, that the army would think that somehow they were too delicate to sort of duck behind a bush if they needed to pee, or even to use the same latrines as the men. So these various objections came up time and time and time again when women applied for permission to go to the front line, because World War II, unlike the Spanish Civil War 2 years earlier, was well, there was an attempt to organize it from the top. That the press were all meant to travel in designated press transport. They were all meant to sleep in designated press accommodation. They went to military briefings where they were told what they needed to know. They were sort of shepherded around by what were known as PROs, the public relations officers. And so if women were theoretically excluded from this organization, from this corralling of the press, it was incredibly difficult for them. They didn't have access to transport, to accommodation, or the press briefings. But because they variously had good contacts in the army, or they had amazing amounts of initiative, or they were just simply prepared to break the rules and hitch their own ways to the front, they did get there. They did do the reporting. And time and time again, because in a way they were getting to the stories through their own initiative, they often got to stories that were very different from the men's, and sometimes ahead of time of the men. So yeah, it was deeply frustrating for those few dozen women who did make it to the front lines during the Second World War, because they were being hampered so often. But at the same time, it was pretty thrilling, because they were, in a way, traveling their own path to the war. And as I said, getting their own stories.
Well, and being real journalists, or what I think of as a real journalist in the way, I think about, Greece being totally unprepared for journalists. The British wasn't there, so there were no prohibitions against women at the front. And, just to scene set, it seems like because these women had to report in this way, get to the reporting in different ways, hustle in a way that the men didn't have to. And it seemed like, and we can talk later about, how their nerves are affected, but the nerves of steel. And I was wondering if you could quickly tell the story of Helen and Virginia watching the airplane battle in England. Just
Yes,
this juxtaposition of the male journalists and what the female journalists actually, what they were.
Yeah, I mean, for women, I mean, the military were always trying to keep the women away from the action. Their male colleagues were, on the whole, more welcoming, more accepting of them. And there was a kind of healthy competition, if you like, I mean, between the men and the women. But the women also knew that if they were really to succeed, if they were to really get through this war and get to all the places where the war was expanding to, they kind of had to outperform the men as well. And it was in July 1940 when German planes first started bombing Britain, that the incident you're talking about takes place. I mean, of course, if the British War Office was trying to keep women from the front lines abroad, they couldn't prevent them from reporting on what was happening at home. And when the German bombers started coming over the south coast of England to attack ports and industry and some civilian towns, the journalists used to take the train from London down to the south coast to report on these dogfights as British pilots battled with the German pilots, you know, many feet above them in the air. And often it was, as Helen Kirkpatrick, one of my women, would write, it was slightly surreal that, you know, they'd be lying on the cliff tops and the butterflies would be fluttering around and the spring flowers, summer flowers were out, the summer skies were cloudless blue. And it was hard to believe a war was going on. Only you'd be looking up there and occasionally you'd see these planes circling each other and you'd see a puff of smoke, which meant that one had been hit. You'd occasionally see a parachutist bailing out over the sea. But often there was no feeling of carnage, Helen wrote. But one afternoon, one of the German planes started making for the cliff where these journalists were lying and firing its machine guns, at which point one of the male journalists reported all hell broke loose and all the men raced for cover. But Helen Kirkpatrick and Virginia Cowles, who were the two women present, they just stayed where they were, lying on their backs, counting the numbers of planes in the sky, getting their copy, getting their story. And it wasn't that they had a death wish. And I'm sure if the moment if it had reached a real point of crisis, they would have fled too. But while they thought they could get away with it, what mattered for them at that moment was getting the story and also showing those men that, you know, they didn't need to be patronized as women. They were not the weaker sex. They were, in fact, the braver sex at that moment. And it was incidents like those that really won women the respect of their male colleagues and often the envy of their male colleagues, actually.
Well, I think Virginia, you know, we'll talk about each of the women, but the thing that struck me about Virginia was her ingenuity and her ability to use her networks to get at the story. And she was really, her journalist instincts were incredible, but the way she used her network was imperative to how she got to talk to people. And for her, she wanted to talk to all the different sides, just anybody who was involved in anything. And she found herself in some pretty precarious places where a male journalist might never have found himself, and then had to rely on her networks to get to places, but also to get out of places. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you could talk about Virginia and her just incredible use of her network throughout. Yeah,
well, I mean, it's sort of interesting. Virginia started her career as a kind of society girl columnist, writing witty columns about debutantes and drinking and fashion and celebrities. she was ambitious even then to progress onto what she called hard news, more vigorous subjects. But for her to make that progress was very difficult, because in America at that time, very few women worked in hard news. You know, they were usually in the ghetto of what were called, you know, soft women's subjects. And the way she kind of progressed out of that women's angle towards being a foreign correspondent was already by using the people she knew. I mean, she was incredibly charming, Virginia, very glamorous, very, very attractive. She kind of collected people. She had a knack for that. And so, for instance, in 1935, when she'd had no experience of foreign affairs, international affairs, foreign journalism at all, she persuaded her editor to send her to Italy just as the Italian dictator Mussolini was embarking on an invasion of Abyssinia, now, which is now Ethiopia. And Virginia had this idea that, yeah, she probably couldn't talk about the politics of it, the military aspect, but it would be interesting if she went to Rome to write a kind of color piece about how the Italian people viewed this incoming war, what they thought about their dictator, about his sort of desire to build an empire for Rome. And when she arrived, she fell headlong in love with an extremely glamorous and well-connected Italian journalist who, feeling actually rather guilty very guilty when he discovered that actually he had been Virginia's first lover, that actually she was not as sophisticated as she appeared. He then felt the least he could do for her was to get her an invitation to a very high-profile political dinner in Rome, where she was seated next to the press attaché to Mussolini. And she kind of, basically as a matter of form, says, well, do you think you could get me an interview, an exclusive interview with Mussolini? And, you know, he kind of waves his hands around and kind of looks dubious. And she thinks no more of it until the next morning, she's woken up with a phone call saying, yeah, okay, you've got your interview at 6. And she's like completely aghast and horrified. I mean, she never expected this to happen. Spends all day unable to eat, desperately trying to prepare stories for what turns out to be his exclusive interview. So that was her kind of first instance of how, yes, her contacts could work for her. And it was her first demonstration to her editor that actually Virginia's social skills could kind of work in his favor and get maybe some kind of interesting international coverage that maybe a male journalist wouldn't get. So in 1937, when she says she would like to go and report on the Spanish Civil War, even though she knows nothing of Spain and nothing of war, he agrees. And so Virginia pitches up in Madrid, which is the stronghold of the Republican army, who are defending themselves against the fascist dictator Franco, who's, well, would-be dictator, who's attempting a coup. And she earns the scorn and hilarity of the other press who are already in Madrid, because she pitches up wearing a kind of little tailored wool dress and a fur jacket and high-heeled suede shoes, which, you know, look like she's more outfitted for a Manhattan tea party than kind of trudging through the muddy trenches around Madrid. But it's this outfit that earns her another amazing scoop when she accidentally ends up at the HQ of a division of Soviet soldiers, where the press are not meant to be, because the presence of Russian soldiers in Spain is very secret. No one's meant to know about it. And the general in charge of this HQ takes one look at Virginia and sees this ridiculously glamorously dressed woman, and is very contemptuous of her. I mean, she looks, apart from being utterly ill-suited to war, you know, she looks the epitome of a kind of bourgeois woman who, you know, he's politically bound to disapprove of. But he's very taken by her. And 3 days later, he invites her to lunch at the HQ. And Virginia's like, oh, this is amazing. You know, this is going to be the best scoop ever. So without telling anyone, she gets a driver to take her to the Soviet HQ, and it's absolutely wonderful. There's a lunch there for her, and there's flowers on the table. And it all passes very pleasantly. And then she realizes that, in fact, the general isn't going to let her go, and that he's going to keep her kidnapped for several days because in his sort of mix of disapproval of Virginia and also deep romantic attraction, he decides it's his duty to try and convert her to Marxism because he believes in, you know, the war in Spain will eventually lead to general international communist takeover, and he doesn't want Virginia to be on the wrong sides of the barricades. And so he keeps her at this HQ for 3 days, teaching her the basic principles of Marxism while feeding her champagne. And at the end, you know, out comes Virginia with yet another scoop that no male journalist would ever have got. But at the same time, because no Western journalists are meant to be there, it exposes her to considerable suspicion, because journalists in Spain, on both the Republicans and the nationalists, were terrified of espionage, and they assumed very often that journalists were likely to be spies. And for that reason, it was very difficult for a journalist to cross between the two lines to report from Madrid, but also from Franco's Spain. But Virginia, who's determined to do what virtually no other journalist has done, uses her contacts to get a visa into Franco's Spain, where for about 2 or 3 months she travels around and witnesses firsthand how brutal Franco's occupation of Spain is, and how frighteningly strong is the presence of Italian and German planes and soldiers who are helping Franco. And at the end of her time there, because she's being watched over by a very aggressive fascist minder, she comes under suspicion because as careful as she is, she can't help but betray that her sympathies really are with the Republicans rather than with the fascists or the nationalists. And it's very clear to her that it's made very clear to her that she's not going to be allowed to leave, that it looks as if she's going to be in jail very soon. And, you know, there she is stuck. Nobody knows she's there. She's got no knowledge of how to get out. But then, as she describes in her subsequent memoir, she just keeps bumping into people who, over the course of 2 days, give her lifts, put her up for the night, introduce her to other people. And by various shifts, she's basically transported illegally out of nationalist Spain and back to the safety of France. You know, the last wonderful leg of that journey, when a British diplomat nips over the border in his diplomatic car and kind of smuggles her across past the Spanish guards. So, you know, she's constantly in places where she shouldn't be, but constantly she seems to just find people who she knows, who are very fond of her, who will do their best to get her out of whatever escapade or crisis she's managed to get herself in. So the title of her memoir, Looking for Trouble, is pretty accurate throughout her reporting career.
I was just I mean, her network, her ability to network is just fascinating to me. You know, when we read about Martha Gellhorn in your book, what really struck, what I'd love to hear you chat about her is, her idealism and her high moral ground and her passion for right and wrong, and how that moved with her, and how that dictated her reporting, and how that made her a little bit unique, not unique, but how it exhibited itself, how that high moral ground exhibited itself in her life and reporting, before the end of the war. Obviously, what she saw at the end of the war is a different conversation, but I'd love for you
Yeah,
to explain that a little further. And for those of you, Martha Gellhorn, many people just know as Hemingway's wife, but we, through the correspondence and everything else, know her as much, much more. But I think it's this perspective of hers that makes her so fascinating to me.
yeah. Well, she went out to Madrid with Hemingway, and that's where their affair really took off. And the two of them had gone to Spain absolutely on the side of the Republicans, absolutely convinced that this was a turning point in history where the battle was being fought between freedom and democracy, between fascism and liberty, and between lies and truth. And Martha, who was no more experienced in war writing than Virginia was absolutely determined to use her journalism in Spain to preach to the world the righteousness of the Republican cause, and also to try and persuade America, who was neutral, taking a neutral, non-interventionist position, to actually drop that stance and convince them that Franco had to be stopped and the Republicans had to be saved. And it was interesting that, I mean, she and Virginia first ran into each other in Madrid, and not only was Martha kind of pretty scornful of Virginia's outfit, but she was also at that point very unsympathetic to Virginia's desire to try and report the war from both sides. What Virginia saw as fair-mindedness, impartiality, a kind of search for truth, Martha saw as a kind of compromise, a sort of reneging of the high moral ground. She didn't think anybody should be writing about the fascists except in the most violently negative terms. And that passion to change public opinion so that the forces of good would prevail, that really idealistic belief that a journalist at their best could be a force for real good, continued with Martha, well, all her life really, but very strongly through the Second World War. And not only did she want to find out the truth of the conflict as it unfolded, but I think that passion for truth also made her one of the most intrepid of my 6 women in battling against the bureaucracies that tried to prevent her. I mean, she was so fired up with anger against fascism. She became fired up with anger against her husband, Ernest Hemingway, who at a certain point ceased being proud of Martha as a journalist and began to see her as a rival and as a wife who was actually preferring to be gallivanting off to the front line rather than looking after him at home. And the anger, there's the most famous story in Martha's War was when she arrived in London in June 1944, just as the Allies were preparing the armada of ships that would cross the Channel to France and begin driving the German army out of France and back into Germany. And she was desperate to report on this, but it was going to be the biggest story. It was going to be the turning point of the war. And she was absolutely furious to discover that although 500 journalists were going to be allowed to cross the Channel with that armada of ships, none of them were to be women. And she spent the first morning of the invasion stuck in a big press room with lots of other people in London hearing news of the fighting. on the Normandy beaches being relayed secondhand. And she was like, I have not come to Europe for this. You know, if the military won't let me there, if the military won't let me go, I will find my own way. So she basically gets a train down to the southern ports of England, blags her way past the military police who's guarding the port, saying, oh, I've just come to interview some American nurses before they cross the channel. You know, I promise I'll do nothing else. And then nips aboard a hospital ship she sees moored by the port, ready to disembark, ready to set off that night. Finds an empty bathroom, locks herself in, and basically rides stowaway to France. And it's an extraordinary risk she's running, because if she's discovered on board, you know, she'll be sent back, and also she'll be court-martialed. But it pays off with some of the most marvelous writing of her career, because she arrives at Normandy, at the coast near Normandy, on the second day of the invasion, and still the sea is, as she says, the most gigantic naval traffic jam in history. I mean, there's ships as far as the eye can see. There's also terrible carnage, dead bodies bobbing around in the sea, brutal fighting going on just on the beaches. But because she's aboard a hospital ship, and offers her services, Martha doesn't just get to report the invasion from the ship. She's allowed to go ashore with the medical teams, and spends 24 hours helping them to rescue injured bodies from Omaha Beach and ferry them back on board the ship, which means that, unlike most of the male journalists, and certainly unlike Ernest Hemingway, who only ever got to report the Normandy landings from aboard a craft, she was there. She was on Omaha Beach for 24 hours, seeing absolutely close hand the fighting and the extraordinary courage and the extraordinary harrowing casualties that resulted from those first few days. She paid a price for that. I mean, she was court-martialed. She was back in London. She was sort of imprisoned in a nurse's training camp and told to wait there until they decided what to do with her. But at that point, having seen what could be done by breaking the rules, she just thought, well, that's it. I'm not even going to take any notice of the military anymore. I will report this war entirely solo. And so she basically finds a hole in the fence of the nurses' camp, rolls under it, blags a lift to Italy in a plane, and spends the last year and a bit of the war simply traveling on her own. And by autumn 1944, in fact, women were being given the same privileges as men. You know, the prohibitions were gradually relaxed, so that for the last few months, women were reporting exactly as men did. But even by that point, Martha wasn't interested in, as it were, reconnecting officially with the military. She would do everything on her own terms, and her reporting was extraordinary.
You know, it really was, but I want to move to Clare Hollingworth. You know, you talk in the book about how she got to journalism from her social work and from breaking all the boundaries in her social work. And just while her origins are being there to do the right thing, it's hard to talk about her even in the correspondence without considering the entire rest of her career. I mean, her career as a journalist just has blown my mind. And I'm wondering, and you can talk to this in any way you want to, but you know, between her integrity and the type of journalism she practiced and all the places she went, not only during World War II, but in every single conflict afterwards. She was right there at the peak of the violence and predicting everything, and just being there and seeing, clear-eyed seeing. And I'm wondering, are there any journalists from the time who are in her category?
Yeah, I mean, Clare, I think, of all my women, was the most obsessed by getting the story first. I mean, one of the distinctive features, say, of Martha Gellhorn's journalism was that she wrote for a magazine. So, for instance, not only were her articles longer, which meant she could explore the human dimensions of war, when she could she could write individual stories about people she met, about individual soldiers, individual civilians. But also she didn't have a daily deadline, whereas Clare always worked for daily newspapers. So for her, getting the story straight as history was being made, straight as the action was happening, was an obsession with her. And that she could do it, that she had the kind of particular nerve and stamina and dedication, was kind of shown to her right at the beginning of her career, because she'd literally only been a journalist for a week before she was sent down to Poland in late August 1939, when when Germany, France, and Britain were still sitting around the negotiating table, when Britain was desperately trying to avert a war and prevent Germany from invading Poland, Clare was kind of convinced, well, she thought actually the whole thing was going to explode pretty soon. And so the minute she was sent down to southwest Poland, very near the German border, she thought, well, I'm just going to see what's going on in Germany, see if they are looking as peaceful as they're pretending to be, if I can see if there's, any kind of sign of military activity. So she borrows a diplomat's car, drives over the border with absolutely no papers, no permit. She could have been arrested as a spy or even shot. And she's driving around the border region of Germany and lucks into the most amazing sight, which is she's along one road, very straight road. She notices there's a very odd kind of screening has gone up, these giant Hessian screens, which are clearly designed to conceal something. And as she's driving past, a very fortuitous gust of wind blows up and one of the screens is blown slightly open, and she goes over and looks, and there are 9 panzer divisions, tanks, armored vehicles parked in that valley, very close to the border with Poland, clearly ready to be mobilized. And so Clare rushes back over the border, files her first story ever as a journalist, which is, forget the negotiations. This is what I've just seen. Clearly Germany has very, very bellicose intentions towards Poland. And then 2 days later, when Britain is still desperately hoping against hope to avert the invasion, she's woken at dawn on September the 1st by the sound of anti-aircraft fire and the rumble of tanks, and clearly the invasion's begun. So her second scoop is to telegraph to London that, yes, I can confirm the invasion started. But then she rings up the embassy in Warsaw, the British embassy, to say, well, you might think negotiations are still ongoing, but, I can tell you the invasion started. And one of the embassy staff is going, no, you've got it wrong. So she puts the telephone receiver out of the window and says, well, you can hear for yourself. The invasion has begun. And that was kind of typical of Clare's style throughout the war, that she would take astonishing risks and kind of be blown along by extraordinary good luck, good timing. And she would keep getting these stories. And unlike really any of her other colleagues during the war, she would persist in that mode as a journalist for the rest of her career. And she loved, for a woman who actually throughout her 20s was an absolutely committed pacifist and worked with the League of Nations to try and keep the world from going to war. Once she became a war journalist, it was as if she'd just discovered not the happiest place. I mean, she was as appalled by anybody else by the violence and the suffering, but it was what excited her beyond anything. She loved writing about war. She loved writing about weapons. I guess if you were stereotyping male and female journalists, it was Clare who most sought to make herself not only as good as a man, but as better than a man. And after the Second World War was over, she reported from crisis spots in Algeria, in the Middle East, in Israel, Vietnam. Or she traveled constantly, and she was still pretty much writing about foreign affairs into her 90s. And because her career, it was interesting, her career kind of overlapped with the period when journalists were beginning to depend more and more on social media, on the internet for doing their research and making their contacts. Clare, who was such an old-fashioned journalist, who would always go to a place, who would need to be physically present to see the story, to talk to the contacts, to smell what was going on the ground. She came to be seen as a sort of heroine of a very particular, rather endangered kind of journalism, where you always had to be where the trouble was, and you always had to exert yourself to your absolute limit to get the story, that you didn't just tap away on your typewriter and see what Twitter would say.
And Claire is such a contrast to me to Lee Miller, who you can enter her biography from many different locations, but to me, how she even got into war reporting, as you mentioned, she was in London during the Blitz, and her photos telling the story in ways that were better than propaganda. You talk about a pile of bricks entering a church instead of people entering a church. And later, as she's walking into Dachau, everybody photographed the bodies, but she's the only person who photographed super close up on the faces. And to me, her, as opposed to Claire, who is, the most masculine, we say masculine, but the most adrenaline junkie on the front lines, everything else. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Lee and her particular photographer's perspective in her writing, but that seemed to contrast Claire a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Lee, of course, is the most unlikely of my six to ever even have become a war journalist, because, in her 20s, she'd been this fashion model for Vogue and Vanity Fair. She was the muse and mistress and model for Man Ray, the great surrealist photographer and artist. When she took off on her own photography studio, she tended to work with celebrities, with fashion accounts, with society people. So she wasn't indifferent to world affairs, but politics, wars never impinged on her work at all until she, as you say, found herself in London in 1939. And as a staff photographer of Vogue, found herself not only taking pictures of utility fashion, but also of London being blitzed. And the photographs she took because she'd had this training with Man Ray, who was a great surrealist, who taught her to look for poetry and very odd, serendipitous, surprising objects or perspectives. She did, the photographs she took were very different from the sort of run-of-the-mill images of sort of cheeky, chirpy air raid wardens or women working on munitions factories, or even London burning. There was always something haunting and strange and resonant about her images. And when she eventually in 1942 and 43 began producing these long photo essay pieces for Vogue on military subjects, she became then, only then, kind of very ambitious to actually see the war for herself. And it was fascinating that, to me, that when she was then sent out to France and Germany to report on the last year of the war, the liberation of Paris, the slow push through northern France and into Germany, and eventually, as you say, the opening of the concentration camps, and particularly Dachau. It was amazing that she didn't only just go with her camera, she went with her little baby Hermes typewriter, because Lee, who didn't think of herself as a writer, I mean, she was a great reader, she had a rather wonderful way of kind of conversational style, very witty, very sardonic. She'd never written anything professionally, and yet these pieces she wrote for Vogue were 10,000 word essays of text that accompanied her photos, and she was, in her own way, as passionate a writer as Martha Gellhorn was, in her conviction, in her hatred of the fascists, in her desire to write the stories of individual soldiers, individual civilians who were suffering in the war. And of course, it was amazing that Vogue even published this. You know, when one thinks of how the magazine is now, a sort of fashion and celebrity Bible, that it would devote pages and pages to this really raw, harrowing material that Lee wrote. And yes, when she went into Dachau, it was as if she put a sort of veil over her emotions and was absolutely determined to just document everything that she saw. And one of the grimmest photos she took was there was just outside the camp, with the last transport to Dachau was still parked, all these a row of cattle trucks that were full of what were now dead bodies. And people were taking photographs, but Lee climbed inside one of those trucks, you know, right inside with the dead bodies and the flies and the stink, so that she could record the actual faces of those bodies. I think it was really important to her always to look beyond the cliche of war reportage, and to, as Martha did in her own writing, to see the full humanity of the subject, and not to spare herself in documenting it.
You know, Helen Kirkpatrick, to me, and she reminds me of kind of water on the stone. You know, she has a setback. In terms of propelling herself forward in her career or her life, but there's not a word for it, but just slowly, she's like water, just moving the stone slowly over time to go her way. And, you know, from being in Geneva and meeting wanting to go into the newspapers, and then being shut down, and then later that's the same man who wants her to come. I mean, we can touch on, you know, her timeline exemplifies this in a million different ways, from well, you know, and all of our listeners will know because they will read the book, but um, I'm wondering, you can take this to all of the women, but I'm curious about the self-belief that you saw in these women
Mm.
as they're moving through, as they're hitting all these obstacles. And oh, by the way, they're in the middle of war.
Yeah.
But Helen specifically, especially because she had kind of a jagged path of success, setback,
Yeah.
but she's constantly going forward to it. I was wondering if you could use Helen as a lens to talk about self-belief.
Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting question, because I mean, it, you're absolutely right. It not only took guts and ambition for these women to put themselves right at the front line of not only the actual fighting, but in the battle for women's rights to report, to do their work. It did take a level of self-belief, arrogance. I mean, Claire, I think, had a certain kind of arrogance that got her through, as did Martha. Um, with Helen, it was something more steady, more stoic that drove her. I mean, she was an interesting character. She was over 6 foot tall, uh, and her mother had wanted her to be a kind of debutante, to be to make a good marriage, to have a very conventional career. And as Helen said, as a teenager, nothing was worse for her than being steered around a dance floor by boys that only came up to her shoulder and trying to come up with small talk which she was hopeless. So she had a sense of herself as a failure, if you like, early on. But what she really wanted to do always was write and to learn. So she persuaded her mother to let her take up a place she'd won at Smith College, to study history and philosophy. And once there, she knew that this was her goal, that being part of serious events, being among serious people, thinking, arguing, gaining an understanding of the world, that was going to be what drove her, what she needed to be doing with her life. And it wasn't simple. Just if Virginia Cowles had to start her career doing fashion and society columns, when Helen Kirkpatrick wanted to enter journalism, she was absolutely told that women didn't do hard news. They certainly didn't become foreign correspondents, which is what she wanted to be. And so she had the first of her setbacks when journalism seemed closed to her, when also her parents were going through a very bad patch. Her father had lost nearly all their money. They were, in fact, her parents were divorcing. And Helen thought, well, I'm going to have to earn a living somehow and help support my family. So she spends 6 months in a kind of management course at Macy's department store, which she absolutely hates. To get out of that, she makes a very unfortunate marriage. Another setback, she gets pregnant, she has an abortion because she knows she has to get out of the marriage. Her life looks an absolute mess, but what she does, she goes back to Geneva, where she'd done a year's studies, an MA in international relations, and steadily works her way up to become an apprentice journalist, to become a stringer, earns so much respect from the other journalists she's working for that she ends up in London with a good job. And by the time war breaks out, she is writing in foreign affairs for the London office of the Chicago Daily News. And although she, like the other women, is faced with all the prohibitions of the War Office, she can't get to the front line to write all the action pieces she wants at first. She, rather than breaking the rules like Martha does, or charming her way to the front like Virginia did, Helen basically just impressed people. She was so good at her work. She absorbed material very, very fast. She was very, very, very good on analysing the politics of war, the politics of the power struggles between the different generals. She could analyse a military situation really well. And it got to the point where General Eisenhower himself was so impressed by Helen's journalism that he gave her special privileges. And even before other women were officially being allowed to join the official press corps and go to the front line, Helen had been given special privileges. So she was the first woman to officially follow the Allied armies through France, and she was the first Allied female journalist to walk into Paris the morning after it was liberated.
Well, there are three more things that we're getting to the end of an hour, but we've got to keep going because we need to talk about Sigrid. We need to talk about the mechanics of sending copy and information. And then I want to ask you a question kind of about all the women that you've written about, just for those of you who are losing attention at an hour. Those are the three things we're going to hit before we close here. But, Sigrid is so different than all the other women, because as these other women are running around covering the story, trying to get this and that, Sigrid is in Berlin as Hitler's rising to power, as there's a slow tightening and changing of things around her, and she's simultaneously sending copy, subverting the censors to send copy, and getting people out and saving people's stuff. And you found out through your research and kind of broke it to the world that she's also Jewish while doing all this, which just adds a whole nother element of intensity. And her story is a movie in itself. And I hope that the effect of this, and I know so many movie people are all gallivanting around books, every one of these women's story is a movie, but Sigrid's is the most marketable movie. I'm wondering if, and before we'll go to this, we'll talk about the mechanics of sending copies. We can address that later in the essence of time. I mean, we could tell her whole biography, but I'm wondering if you could zero in on her salons and the dinners she threw, and how she sat people in such a volatile, changing place with the power dynamics moving around her, and just the political maneuvering she did before she wrote a single word, not only for her sources, but to also be able to exist in Berlin at this moment in time as a journalist.
Yeah. So we're talking basically about the years from 1933 to 1941, which after Hitler and the Nazis came to power. And Sigrid was Berlin bureau chief for the Chicago Tribune. And so she was responsible for reporting on what was going on in Germany. And of course, she was horrified, as the persecution of Jews, the elimination of political opponents, the crackdown on all freedoms in Germany became more and more intense year by year. And she felt it was her absolute duty to inform the world what was going on. But even though there was no actual censorship of the foreign press, they were getting so restricted in what they could write, because everything they read, every word they wrote, was scrutinized. And if they were seen to be somehow crossing the line of what was acceptable to the Nazi Party, they were either deported, they were arrested, beaten up, interrogated. I mean, Sigrid received several death threats during her time in Berlin. So treading this fine line between trying to write as accurately and as hard-hittingly as she could about Nazi Germany, at the same time preserving herself and her staff, was a daily tightrope for her. And she was considered to be, even by her competitive male colleagues, to be the best at it, because she was fluent in 5 languages. Her German was perfect, which was one huge asset. But she also had the best network of sources and in the city, and she'd built that up slowly by holding these fortnightly or monthly salons where she would cook and serve fine wine, and she would invite everybody who mattered in Berlin from all the different walks of life: trade unionists, politicians, artists, teachers, intellectuals. And she would use them to gain information. She was very good at placing people next to each other so that maybe they would be encouraged to perhaps be more indiscreet than they might be on their own. And she also used those salons to cultivate certain members of the Nazi Party, because much as she disapproved of them, she knew it was in her interests to get as much sort of inside dirt on them as she could. And kind of in the early years, at least, she had a very useful relationship with Goering, who kind of lulled into the belief that he was using Sigrid as a mouthpiece to get over the party's views. He was actually being fabulously indiscreet and giving her information that actually the party didn't want out there at all. This continued throughout the 30s, and it got more and more dangerous for her to sort of tread this line. Goering turned on her, tried to get her incriminated as a spy, more threats, more intimidation. At one point, she began writing under an alias, invented a character called John Dixon, to whom she ascribed her most critical articles in an attempt to kind of protect herself. I forgot what your question was. Or have I answered it? I mean,
you answered it, because I think it just how she exists, and we can take this moment, because one of the things, and I'm going to ask a long-winded question, but I think it takes us to the next place for Sigrid. I was wondering if you could, just for our walking around knowledge, kind of go into some of the mechanics of getting this information from where these women were to where it was being printed. And I know there's a lot of different ways to do that. I mean, you mentioned in one footnote the Press Wireless Center in Paris. At certain times they're telegraphing. And I'm wondering what the censors actually looked like the military censors who are going through that. And I'm wondering if you could walk us through some of which makes it all the more amazing that Clare Hollingworth also was a reporter when we had the internet. But if you could walk us through the mechanics of transmitting information, then maybe we could talk about what Sigrid, towards the end of her reporting, what some of the steps she took.
Well, in a way, it's easier if I go with her first, because she, of course, was still, she was not out in the chaos of a front line. She was still in the city. But the problem for her, of course, as time went on, was that all the phone lines were tapped. The government ran the telegraph services. So she would sometimes physically leave Germany. If she had a really hard-hitting article she wanted to print, she would actually leave Germany physically to either phone through or telegraph through her copy, so that she would be free of surveillance. later on, when it became harder to travel, she set up a private phone line to Denmark, and she paid, which again would be free of German Nazi surveillance, and would paid someone in Denmark to then take her copy and phone it through to her office in New York. So for her, she was still using the conventional methods of either a direct telephone or a telegram to deliver her copy. It was just she was having to try and use those electronic methods in ways that were free of German surveillance. But out in the front, that was very different, because obviously, the fighting might have moved to an area where there were no phone lines. I mean, what both the Germans and the Allies did actually when the fighting reached a certain point was to set up temporary lines that would allow very basic telephone and telegram to be sent, to those calls to be sent. And those calls would go through to, certainly by 1944, the main press center for the Allies was the Hotel Scribe in Paris, where all the copy was sent and was then read by the military censors who were in place in the Hotel Scribe and checked for anything that was not. They had to eradicate any information that might be useful, sensitive information that might be useful to the enemy, before it was then sent off to the various newspaper offices around the world. When those facilities weren't available, there were messenger boys on bikes, dispatch boys. They would simply pick up the copy that the journalist had typed out on their increasingly battered typewriter and physically bike it to the nearest airfield, where it was then put on a plane, and then the plane would take it to the Hotel Scribe, where again the censors would read it, and then it would be again transmitted on. Sometimes when, for instance, when the army was fixed in a certain place, like in the North America or in northern France at the beginning of the invasion, there would be censors on site at one of the press camps. So the journalists would type out their copy, the censor would be there to read it, to check it for sensitive material before it was then transmitted on. So there was a number of different methods and different systems in place depending on where you were reporting from, really, or how frantic and how chaotic the war situation was. I mean, Helen Kirkpatrick wrote during the last months of the war, when she was zigzagging around Germany, that she couldn't believe how much copy got transmitted back to its intended newspaper desk and how accurate it was, because things were so chaotic. There weren't even any sort of, people were moving around so fast. There were no sort of houses or hotels or camps where the press were even based half the time. And so there was no central site where these transmitters and these sensors were located. Everyone was just writing stuff on a typewriter, hoping a dispatch rider would kind of drive past at some point and hand it over. And she said what was interesting at that point too was that the censors were bothering less and less, because the news was changing so fast that by the time a story arrived at its desk, it was already out of date anyway, and the information was no longer sensitive. So yeah, it was a very, very varied, volatile picture, really, the filing of copy.
Well, it's fascinating to me, and I hope it's been illuminating to our listeners and viewers but it also just reinforces to me and why I end with Sigrid, because I think everyone was so brave, but her bravery to me just struck a chord more than anything else, between being a known human in one place in Berlin, filing these stories, entertaining people as she knew she was Jewish. I mean, just her bravery. This is why she's the Hollywood story, even among, Lee Miller and all of our famous Hollywood starlets. But taking it to there, I just want to read some of the names of the women who you have studied, some of whom I've heard, some of whom I haven't, and now I have to know because I know the type of women you pick to illuminate. Martha Gellhorn, Lee Miller, Sigrid Schultz, Virginia Cowles, Clare Hollingworth, Helen Kirkpatrick, Lady Diana Cooper, Nancy Kennard, Tallulah Bankhead, Zelda Fitzgerald, Josephine Baker, Tamara de Lempicka, which you are now going to...
De Lempicka.
Thank you. You're going to have to help me with some more. Mrs. John Maynard Keynes.
Keynes, yes, that's Lydia Lopakova, who was married. Keynes, the economist, was her husband.
Oh, I haven't read that book yet. Louisa Custodi, Doris Castle Rossi. Castle Ross, Peggy Guggenheim, and as we mentioned, Mrs. John Maynard Keynes, Lydia Lopakova. You know the how your pronunciation of Russian, as you've written all these books about dance, but I knowing your body of work and who you've studied, I just imagine what's up in your head that you have not put into a book. And I'm wondering, as you look at all these women, what your thoughts are about how, if you could draw some conclusions. It's too many and too off the cuff. Yeah. These are women who changed the world, who lived completely differently than their time, who did not conform. And I was wondering if there was anything you wanted to leave us with, because you've spent time engaging with such amazing people.
That is a huge privilege, I have to say. I mean, some of those women are more admirable than others. Some of them are more likable than others. But what I guess they have all had in common is that they've all pushed the boundaries of their lives. They've all looked at what they were born with and wanted to do something different with it. And although none of them, or not many of them, would have consciously set themselves up as role models, I do think, for my generation, for your generation, that body of kind of experience and courage and transgression and adventure that those women represent, we've piggybacked on the shoulders of that. And it does give us courage to keep pressing forward. And I think women's history is now much better represented than it used to be. I think it's, we understand that just because women aren't or didn't used to be the great statesmen, the great world shakers, not necessarily the best known artists, they were still doing extraordinary work, and work that they need to be recognized for. And they are an example, and writing, I wrote the second half of this book during the pandemic, and that was pretty extraordinary for me, because even though I was very aware of the trauma and the suffering and the limitations that so many people were experiencing during the pandemic, and particularly during the lockdowns, to be coming to my desk every day and just writing about, Martha riding stowaway, Sigrid facing death, women just living so much on the edge and suffering, facing so much danger and experiencing so much deprivation. It it was a very, very, very good perspective for me to have, I must say, during that 18 months.
You write about, and I'm forgetting who it was who gets into Paris, but nobody's in Paris. It's by the time the train arrives, it's like her, one other guy, and this Egyptian who's
Yeah,
coming
that's
back.
Virginia. That's
Virginia.
Virginia.
Of
Always
course,
going to
but she
places that
networks her
everybody
way
else is
out of it
going.
because only Virginia could be able to get out of that.
Yeah.
But you describe her that nobody is in a cafe, the empty streets, and it felt like the pandemic images of just everybody out of public view for their own safety, and it echoed that. So it makes sense that you were probably writing that during the lockdowns.
Yeah.
Well, I could talk with you honestly all day, and as I hope maybe we will get to chat again as I read more of your books.
I would love that.
Okay, done. We know how to communicate, so we'll make that happen. But for those of you who are listening now, I want to thank you for tuning in. For those of you watching later, I want to thank you as well. I hope you enjoyed this. The Correspondents is available from the Country Bookshop. I highly encourage you get this book. And thank you, Judith, so much for your time.
Thank you. And happy holidays to you all from non-Thanksgiving London.
Thanksgiving time. Well,
yeah.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.